sure he has top parenting hacks. Maybe we'll find out. But what he does have is in-depth knowledge of Clare and indeed Ireland's history. That is the local historian and author and fantastic shirt wearer, Colm Liddy. Good morning to you.
Why, thank you, Alan. You noticed.
I know. How could I not? If I need to put on a pair of sunglasses, I say that, but I mean, I have similar. What would we call them? Psychedelic looking shirts, Colm?
Indeed.
Thanks for being with us. Any top parenting hacks?
Oh my God, don't ask me. I mean, I've had a bunch of them and they're all right, I guess.
Are they legal?
That's all that can be said.
They're all right. They're all right, okay. Right, we are tipping our way through history, and today you're going to be talking about William Smith O'Brien.
Indeed.
Why?
Part one.
Part one.
This man deserves 2 episodes. So who is he? Well, he was born and raised in Dromoland. He's a Clare man. He was, of the O'Brien class that owned a lot of the land in Clare, but and that indeed they stretch all the way back to Brian Boru, their ancestry. But he was a second son, so therefore never going to inherit the estate or the title. So as a consequence, he lived a very interesting life. And 2 things I would say of his adventurous life is, I would reckon he is the first Clare man that visited all 5 continents.
Wow.
Can't confirm that, but I can't think of anybody else.
And at a time when it would have involved a lot of effort to visit all 5 continents.
I mean, in one case, it involved being sent as a prisoner to Australia, but still.
Doesn't matter how or why he got there, he got there.
But he was in South America, he was in America, Africa, Asia, Europe naturally. So yeah, he's done it all. And indeed, another thing about him is there's a statue to him on O'Connell Street in Dublin. Right there opposite Supermax. You could easily miss it.
Yeah. Well, why Dublin?
Well, I mean, he is a national figure. He's one. He's one of the main national figures of nationalism in Ireland, and he had his moment and so on, as we'll get to. So yeah, statue there on our main street in the capital.
Lovely stuff. Right, let's go through why he ended up with a statue on the O'Connell Street in our capital. Talk to us about the early years of William Smith O'Brien.
So, as was typical at the time, born around the year 1800, sent to England at the age of 9 for his education in Harrow and Cambridge.
Wow.
Nothing left undone there. But then, as I say, a second son, so had a few wilderness years after college, as many people have, shall we say, drinking and carousing.
So while his name was William, he was very much a Harry.
He was. He came back to Clare and he did something very few members of the gentry did. He actually explored the place. He went all over Clare. He drove on his horse, went around and, had little adventures. Some adventures maybe he could have done without. He is reckoned to have had fathered 2 children out of wedlock.
Just 2.
Presumably with Catholic peasants, and in both cases it was hushed up. They were given whatever money it took to go away. But because of all this going around Clare, he had, in fairness, more affinity with the peasant class than most, who kind of held aloof. And at another stage as well, he had a bit of a temper. He got involved in a duel with pistols at Ballycorey Racecourse in Ennis. That's no longer exists. Essentially, it's just out the Tulla Road, you might say, is where it existed. But he had a duel, and how it went down is he and the man stood opposite each other, and William pulled his trigger first, except nothing happened.
Oh.
His second had failed to pull the hammer back correctly, and the rules of the game were you couldn't. Now it just
so he'd fired his shot technically, so he had to stand there.
Nothing even happened, and then he had to stand there and let the other guy shoot.
Oh God!
Without flinching, and he did, and the bullet whizzed past. So that's it. Honor restored.
Okay, so they both live to tell the tale.
Yeah.
Oh wow! I guess that's the way they would have wanted it to work out. Okay, so he had his adventures, but as you say, unlike some of the other landowners and aristocracy, he had an affinity with the locality.
He did. So he winds up anyway entering politics, as many second sons would. He's the MP for Ennis. Is his first thing from the 1820s. It doesn't take any effort if you're an O'Brien. You walk into that position. I think the electorate in Ennis at that time was like 10 people.
All of a certain class.
And all of whom can be bought and paid for. So, but that is standard. That's British democracy in action in those days. So he gets into the House of Commons, and in fairness, he immediately makes a mark. He's not just going to be there to make up the numbers. He's giving speeches, and what's remarkable is how well researched they are. He doesn't just spout stuff. He actually researches the topic. So he makes a bit of a name for himself. And the other thing at this time of his life is where he gets the name Smith. I mean, his name is William O'Brien. The Smith comes from his maternal grandfather, who decides to leave him a mini estate in his will. And his name was Smith. So that's where he has to kind of take on the grandfather's name. And he also marries a Limerick woman, Lucy Gabbett from Limerick City. And that's how he ultimately transfers to the Limerick constituency later on for many of his elections. But I say he makes a decent effort. He's always there for Irish politics, and he gives a massive speech in 1843 called The Reasons for Discontent in Ireland, and he lists them all out. Naturally, Britain is not too interested to hear.
No surprise there. As you mentioned, a key figure, a big figure in nationalism. Talk to us about, there's more than one strand of nationalism.
There is. It begins to develop. I mean, the main man, of course, is still Daniel O'Connell. And by 1843, he has decided to really push for repeal of the Act of Union. So that is the year in which there's monster meetings all over Ireland. Truly astonishing. Still to this date, probably the biggest political meetings that were ever held of the citizenry. So you have like 300,000 people come to a meeting in Ennis. And all around the country, and Munster in particular, there's huge gatherings of 250,000. And finally, 500,000 people come to Tara, the symbolic Tara up in Meath.
Like, what's amazing about these conversations, we're talking about an era pre the kind of technology we enjoy now. So it wasn't like they had a PA system and a microphone and massive speakers.
Yeah.
The only speaker they had was William Smith or Daniel O'Connell. So a crowd of 500,000 people, is it just literally word being passed along from the front as to what's being said?
What did he say?
And, can you imagine being at the back, how different what you're hearing is from what is actually being said?
It was our Woodstock, shall we say, but without amplification. Now, that strand of nationalism is on the belief that we can protest our way to, the better utopia. But there's another strand, which is, shall we say, a group called the Young Ireland group, who are more rash young men who are kind of full of, nationalism, but they are impatient and they realise that unfortunately some violence is going to have to take place. England ain't just going to give it back to us, as Daniel O'Connell hopes. Of those two groups, you would say William O'Brien is outside them for a while, but eventually he starts to gravitate to the Young Ireland group. Okay,
so even he sees that the talking route is just proving fruitless.
Indeed, and we'll say he's finally radicalised by this incident where, as the famine begins, he goes up to the House of Commons and naturally complains about, how dire the situation is. It's early 1846, and their response, they're so sick and tired of this dude in the House of Commons, and I don't know if this has ever happened before, but they insist that he goes onto a committee to look at Scottish railways, on the notion that this will basically waste all his time. He'll be doing this morning, noon and night, and then that'll get him off. He refuses, and so he is actually arrested in the House of Commons and put in a prison in the cellar of the House of Commons
for refusing to join a committee on an issue to do with a country he's not from.
Indeed. So that's basically, it's a pretext, but ultimately I'm not sure if too many people have been imprisoned in the House of Commons, but he was for a month pushed down in the cellar of the House of Commons. And eventually they released him and he came home to Ireland to a hero's welcome. But
not having to join that committee.
Yeah. So he kind of felt at that stage there was no point any further, dealings with the House of Commons. So he's at home now, and Irish politics, because of course of the famine and everything, is just building and building. There's two incredible newspapers at that time, the most important called The Nation, which is just broadcasting seriously seditious, traitorous stuff week in, week out. And even there's another even more radical one, which is telling people how to make a pike. A pike, I'm referring to the long stick with a pointy bit at the end, and all that sort of talk. So Ireland is getting more and more radical, at least some of them. Meanwhile, Daniel O'Connell is reaching the end of his days, and it kind of comes to a head in 1847 where he's really now not at his best, so he decides to take a pilgrimage to Rome. And then, quite surprisingly and out of the blue, really, to most people, he dies on his way. And then there's a general election, and it's very fraught between the Young Ireland group and the regular repeal, the peaceful group. So much so when William Smith goes for his election in Limerick, people are throwing stones at him. There's a feeling amongst the very loyal O'Connell people that the Young Irelanders have driven him to his death, by their more radical ways.
And even if, Colm, there is two strands of nationalism, and the Young Islander route is the more, shall we say, abrasive, that it's going to take force to earn Ireland's independence or some sort of breakaway from Britain. No matter what side of nationalism you fall on what side of the divide you fall on, I would imagine the passing of O'Connell was not just a huge moment, but maybe hugely devastating moment for nationalism's cause. People felt like this guy, whether you advocated talking or violence, you felt he was a key figure, and he was getting somewhere.
He was, yeah. And
who would replace him?
Yeah, and what he had achieved in 1828 stood as the only outstanding victory that anybody had done in centuries. So
I think it's about the only one you've been able to tell us about for over the last 600 years.
So, it was huge, and psychologically the country was in a bad place. It's 1847. We'll be getting into all that later. But the next big event then that occurs is that when 1848 rolls around, quite a bit of Europe suddenly starts having revolutions. There's ones in Belgium and all across, in Italy and whatnot. But France was the big one. France are always great at revolutions. Fantastic country, really, for that sort of thing. So they deposed the king and sent him away, and they set up a republic. And William Smith then is part of a Young Ireland delegation that goes out to France. On the one hand, to kind of congratulate them on what they've managed to achieve, and then maybe surreptitiously to see, by any chance, lads, would ye have a few weapons for us? Something we don't really have. We have a lot of, fighting men in Ireland, but absolutely very little weapons except sticks with pointy ends, which may or may not prove sufficient against cannon and musket. So out he goes, and the other famous thing that happens on that particular trip, it happened, I think, in April 1848, is that a bunch of French women presented him and the group with one of the very first tricolours. I mean, the tricolour had been mentioned as a concept, the idea of green and orange and peace between them. Because, just to go backwards, William Smith O'Brien is a Protestant, and many of the Young Irelanders are that. John Mitchell is a Protestant, Thomas Davis. So there is a genuinely ecumenical approach. Yeah. Whereas, in all honesty, O'Connell's group was, because of Catholic emancipation, everything was Catholic, and the Young Irelanders did have that over him, that they were far more, in tune.
A broader church.
With bringing it together. These French women then, of course, it's modelled on the actual French tricolour, and it has ours, but it's an actual physical copy which they brought home of this, one of the first tricolours.
And which was, I suppose, popularised by Thomas Francis Maher.
Yeah, exactly. He's part of that delegation too. So I think we'll leave it there, because the next big thing is we're now heading for, what passes for a rebellion. But the raw materials aren't great. the peasantry are starving, and we'll walk through that in due course.
Sure, this is all going to prove to be a roaring success, right? That's the end of
part one.
If past evidence is anything to go by, right? That's part one of William Smith O'Brien. We'll see where part two takes us the next time Colm is in. As ever, Colm, thank you very much for taking us through a fascinating period of Clare's history, and one of the many fascinating historical figures from Clare. Until the next time we're in, tell us about where people can find out more about you, what you do, and what you sell.
Well, there's copies of a few local history books in all of the good bookshops in Clare, which would include the Ennis Bookshop and the Lahinch Bookshop and the Banner Bookshops in Ennistimon and in Kilrush.
Very good. He's talking about selling Jackson Pollock-esque shirts at some stage on his shop as well, but that's all to come in due course. Colm Liddy, thank you very much.